In the Bible in Colossians, it says that Jesus was the firstborn of every creature. Does this mean that Jesus was created and therefore Jesus was not God? I'll walk through Colossians next, but there's also another passage that we need to discuss before the end of today's video, which will also help us answer today's question. Now, the first thing we need to do is basically just read the verse in question. It's Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 here, where it says, Jesus, speaking of Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. And obviously this word firstborn here gets all of the attention because it will seem to suggest that this is talking about Jesus being the first created amongst other people. Now, it's not like the word firstborn here exclusively means the firstborn in that sense. Firstborn, it could also mean firstborn as in head or rank. And it's always going to come down to the context of the passage that we have to look at to ascertain what usage of the word is actually going to be used. Now, there's a couple of things I want to highlight. Firstly, let us back up one verse in the text and notice what it says. Right, it's speaking obviously about Jesus, and it says, in whom, right, we have redemption through his blood, right, the forgiveness of sins. Obviously, this is an allusion to Jesus's physical body. We can see it talks about redemption, right, and that redemption we know came when he took on flesh and came to die for mankind. But even if it was speaking about him being the firstborn, as in he's the first amongst others, that wouldn't even be necessarily a problem with this passage if you wanted to take that approach. He obviously is the head, the firstborn of all those who are redeemed through him. In the same way mankind is under Adam, all people are under Christ. All that would basically be referring to would be from the time that Christ came in the flesh. But we know from other passages that Christ obviously existed before he came in the flesh. And that's where the better reading, in my opinion, in regards to firstborn here makes more sense. It's not speaking about the flesh anymore. It's now going to go into the eternal backdrop before he came into the flesh, because 16 to 17 says, for by him, same person Christ, were all things created. All things created, ladies and gentlemen, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, right? He's exhausting the language here. Whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by him and for him, right? All things were created for Christ and by him, he's saying here in Colossians. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. That last word there is basically talking about holding things together. Basically, in simple terms, everything is in Christ's hand. When you think about this passage, we've got the physical side of Christ, right, coming to redeem mankind. But then we've also got the eternal side of Christ, right, which is before any physical incarnation, where it talks about how he was the creator of all things, right? And it's telling us it's not just about the things that are in earth, right? It's talking about things that are in heaven, whether it's visible or invisible, right? It's speaking about the whole of creation here. Paul wants to make it so emphatic here as well. He says all things were created 2 times, right, in the same verse. And this isn't speaking about like certain things. This is speaking about all things, just as the Bible tells us Christ created in passages like John chapter 1 or Hebrews 1, etc. But I believe the passage gives us more context in regards to what this is speaking about here, about Jesus being the firstborn of every creature. Because as we continue to read down, right, into verse 18, what does it say? It says, he, speaking about Christ, is the head of the body, the church, right, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all he might have the preeminence. He is first in rank because he raises all people from the dead. He starts with firstborn up here in verse 15 and talks about the firstborn down here again in verse 18. He is the firstborn in that sense because he came to redeem everybody, right? He came to die firstly and then to redeem everybody. And he did this, as it says here, so he can have the preeminence in all things. So he can be before all things because he created all of the heavenly things, the passage said, but he also entered into the creation, saved the creation, and also can have dominion from both sides of the spectrum. This is why we believe Jesus Christ is clearly the God-man. So there's another passage we need to discuss in today's video, and that is Revelation chapter 3, verse 14, where Jesus calls himself the beginning of the creation of God. And now, with the backdrop of how we've discussed in Colossians, it should help us understand this passage where Christ is obviously just talking about the preeminence he has, being obviously firstly eternal, but then secondly entering into the creation, dying to save creation, and ultimately having preeminence over all of creation as well. Now, hopefully this helps you answer today's question. But one of the biggest passages used to attack the deity of Christ is this passage right here, which we discussed in this video, and it gives you a very great answer for you to deal with that particular situation.